is the inner Earth? My first, introduction to any of the inner Earth information was on the smart glass pad. And for those of you who don't watch the show, it was a plexiglass-like pad that if you found it on the ground, you would think it was unremarkable. But there was a bio-neural interface component that worked with it, where it would show you what you wanted by thinking it, and would show you in your language, and you would get three-dimensional displays off of it. It was like a dumb terminal that connected to a database of all of this information. And we had two different databases. One of them was one that was owned by a non-terrestrial group that we're working with. I'm not exactly sure which group it was. I'm fairly certain it was the Nordics. And then we have the database that you connect to that is just the military information, nothing off-world, other than what we've gleaned on our own. So a lot of the time I spent on the research vessel, it was quite boring. I was either wiping down the walls, setting up or breaking down modular rooms for different experiments. So we would get a lot of time to look at these smart glass pads, and for some reason the inner Earth stuff got my attention. I really liked it. And there was a decent amount of information, but it was only probably in the late 70s that some of these beings that were connecting to military types, they were saying they were from a different star system, and it turned out that many of them came from below the Earth, and they were just telling us that for operational security, so we wouldn't, come down and ruin the good thing they have going. And as it states, we had access to a lot of very high-tech data. I was not super scientific-minded, so I stuck to the outline information more than I did the actual scientific papers, which I would tend to get lost in. There are major cavern networks all around the Earth. A lot of these have to do with the creation of geothermal activity, like lava tunnels. Some of them are quite large. Others come from rift systems that have been exploited by non-terrestrials many thousands of years ago. And they had connected rift systems with tunnels that they created. And this was the ancient builder race that disappeared. And since then, different non-terrestrial groups, inner Earth groups, and military groups have been exploiting the same underground waterways and some areas the size of Texas that are open underground. Some of them are so large that condensation builds up, they have rain, they have misty type clouds. The art that I've had depicted, you cannot recreate the feeling of when you walk into a giant cavern and look around, and there's no way that you can really depict the size of these caverns. Amazing. Most of the cavern network that are used by non-terrestrials and humans alike are at the most usually about 40 miles deep or less, within 20 to 40 miles. Interestingly enough, there is some sort of UN law, just like if you go out in the middle of the ocean, you're in international territory where certain laws don't apply. They've written laws like that for space, but also if you go a certain depth in the Earth, after you get a certain miles deep, you're in international territory. You're not, if you went directly below somewhere in Texas, I can't remember how many miles it is, but once you get to a certain point, you're not considered to be in America anymore, and American laws do not apply. That's why they do a lot of their unacknowledged, as Stephen Greer has said, programs is another way of saying illegal. They're not legal. So people that are bound to keep secrets in unacknowledged programs, these are illegal programs, and they shouldn't be held accountable for leaking that information, in my opinion. Interestingly enough, it turns out that humans on the surface have sought refuge in the inner earth many times in our history. Some of the documentation that I saw on the smart glass pad and imagery that was shown were sort of ancient Aztec looking structures that had been abandoned long ago that were inside these caverns, not super deep, fairly close to the surface, where it was obvious that thousands of people had lived there for a protracted amount of time, most likely to allow the surface to return to normal. And what I later found out was that different inner Earth groups, different non-terrestrial groups, were rescuing groups of people on the surface and bringing them under. And it was part of this this grand genetic experiment. There were over 22 different genetic experiments going on the planet. So they are protecting their experiment, their investment. It's kind of like doing an emergency backup so that they don't have to start over again. They found a lot of interesting life below ground. Most of it's been, a lot of it's been reported, but there are some that it would seem like a sci-fi movie. Giant, not exactly mushroom looking, but fungus that give off blue light. Some of them give off like an orange light, green light. There are all these different types of plant-like and fungus-like life forms down there that actually give off light. They'll break down dead material, or some of them actually break down the walls and themselves and pull minerals out of the cave walls. Now, what was really interesting in some of the imagery, there were huge cavern areas where it looked almost like a greenish sky. But what it turns out is that all along the ceiling was this lichen-type matted material that was absorbing the rock and turning as a waste material, putting out bioluminescent light. And it wasn't enough to where you could see super well, but it was almost like wearing a pair of the goggles that the military used for starlight amplification. Of course, we're going to find all the things that slither and crawl down there, and most of them are either blind or have zero pigment in them at all, which I don't think is very surprising. Yeah, the salamanders look really nasty, don't they? So we have, a lot of different types of life, plant life, that is very interesting. But of course, then we start moving up to things that think and eat and breathe the way we do. On Cosmic Disclosure, I talked about this first being that they would see a lot. They had red reflective eyes, large eyes, very pale, human. They were obviously a human group that had come down during one of these cataclysms and never left, and then started to adapt. Supposedly they're very stealthy. You're very rarely going to see one. You might hear them, and if you catch them with your light, you're going to catch a very large pink-red iris on them. But for the most part, they're hard to catch. Unfortunately, when the military expeditions, when they would go down, they would want a closer look at a specimen. They would terminate it and then get a closer look. And unfortunately, The ones that I saw had been shot and were being videoed as they were being pointed at, and the ribs, and they were showing, unemotionally just showing the being they just shot. There are tall black reptiloids that control different areas below ground, and they seem to have their own agenda. A lot of them have mainly been seen in the Middle East and northern Africa type areas underground. Now, there was a comic book that came out a long time ago. It was, can't remember the name of it now. They were talking about these very elephant-looking inner Earth beings they called the Darrow, that were very aggressive, very negative toward human beings. And I had actually seen information about them while I was in the programs. I happened to be 2 years ago at the Conscious Life Expo, before I had become public at all. I went and saw Jupiter Ascending with David Wilcock, and we're sitting in the chairs, and this being pops up, and it looks so similar to the imagery I'd seen. I was like, I slightly was like, whoa. But if you see David tell a story, it's like I had a mild seizure next to him or something. He likes to over-animate everything. But yeah, that movie had some interesting disclosure in it from a very dark perspective. So what is the hollow Earth? This is a story that's been around for a long time. It's not new by any means. What was often believed was that we had a center sun. The inside of the crust was hollow, and on the inside there were just people, sailing around and living just mirror to us on the other side. Well, it turns out that there are large enough areas to where I could see where people could get that idea, that they think it's just one giant empty area. But it's a honeycomb. It's the honeycomb Earth. From centrifugal forces, heating and cooling, the convection of the Earth, over time, it's created this entire zone that are porous, like a honeycomb. And a lot of them connect with each other through rift systems, which I mentioned earlier. And ancient aliens have carved out those areas and made them to where you can transnavigate the planet. So there are underground lakes, oceans, rivers, and a vast amount of water that is locked up in in rocks that is crystallized. And recently, it's been scientifically announced that locked up in the rocks below ground, there's way more water than we have in our oceans. There's plenty of water down there, and a lot of it is very mineral rich, as you would imagine. These underground rivers it's pretty amazing how we have submarines that are navigating these underground rivers. Could you imagine being the Lewis and Clark that discovered and mapped out those areas? I'm sure there's plenty of information about people lost, some harrowing experiences doing that. The legend of Agartha, it really became popular during the 1930s and 40s. The Germans loved it, I guess that area of Europe. And they didn't think of it as a fanciful story. They believed it to be fact. These subterranean civilizations were called the Agartha Network. And many times, as I mentioned earlier, these subterranean groups, they would come up and masquerade as gods or angels. And as we became more sophisticated, they had to change, their story had to be more sophisticated. Then they began to tell us that they came from different star systems. There are definitely other beings from different star systems that look very similar to them that are visiting us. So a lot of people think that I'm trying to say, well, people from Andromeda or this are lying. We just know that they were lying to humanity about where they were from, because they were worried that if we found out where they were, we would come down and invade, which I can't disagree with.